So 2:30, so we'll start the lab session. So hello everyone, my name is Sujin Han. I'm one of the TAs responsible for Project 1, and today I'll be delivering the lab session. So today we'll be releasing Project 1 threads, and then today's lab session will cover two parts of the project: alarm clocks and priority scheduling. So before we move on to the actual lab session, we have a few announcements. So we updated the Pintos grading environment to match the environment in Hedong Lounge environment because we could not set up a virtual box in the Hedong Lounge server. So and that new environment now uses GCC 4.8. So if you are installing a different version of GCC to compile your Pintos, you should use GCC 4.8. So for now, to test your code in the grading environment, if you have an M1 MacBook, use the Hedong Lounge server directly to test your Pintos code in the grading environment. But before you do that, you should follow the instructions on CampusWire to change the default GCC version to 4.8. The GCC 4.8 is installed in the EE Lab G3 server, but then in order to make that your GCC default GCC version, you have to make a few changes to your bash RC. So please follow the read the CampusWire announcement. And for other students, do not use the previous VirtualBox environment. Use the new one. It has the -2. Use the new Pintos environment to test your code in the grading environment. It's different Ubuntu version and different GCC. So they might have different behaviors. So please use the new VirtualBox environment. Yeah, so that's the announcement. Any questions? Okay. And so now I'll talk about the threads. So the Project 1 threads has 4 parts. The first part is alarm clocks, then is priority scheduling, then advanced scheduler, and scheduling latency measurement, which is which has the largest points allocated. And we also have a design document. You have to write a design document for your project. It doesn't have any point allocation, but if you don't submit it, there'll be 5 points deduction. So please submit the design document. So here, the Project 1 is due September 26th, Tuesday, 11:55 p.m. There will be no late submissions accepted, so please submit it on time, actually before the due date. This project is 30% of your project grade, and through these links, you can access the materials you'll need for the projects. So there are a few notes. So please read the project document and the code comments thoroughly before starting to code. We recommend you to use Git to collaborate, but you should set your repository to private. If you set it to public by accident, there might be some plagiarism issues, so please be careful with this. So to submit your code, please submit your completed project to this Google quiz form. And so in this form, we ask you to upload a file, and that file should be a tarball of your Pintos directory. The file name should be the student ID numbers of the students who completed the project, and you can create a tarball with the below command. So I'll move on to the lab session materials. So this part is about alarm clocks. So actually, Project 1 consists of 3 large topics. The first one is alarm clock, second one is priority scheduling, and the third one is advanced scheduler. So today we'll cover alarm clock and priority scheduling. So alarm clocks. So the main goal of alarm clocks is to implement this function, timer sleep, which is a system call that wakes up a process in the ticks amount of time. So right now, the vanilla Pintos code that we gave to you uses busy waiting for this alarm. And now your task for this part of Pintos is to modify the timer sleep function and other necessary functions to use the sleep wake up form alarm. So the files to modify for this part of Pintos are in the thread directory, thread.c and thread.h, and also in the devices directory. And the actual files are, specific files are timer.c and timer.h. So timer sleep in current Pintos, as I mentioned before, it uses busy waiting. So okay, so once we have a thread created, and it's scheduled by a scheduler, but then when it has to sleep for a certain time, then when it goes to running state, it checks time, and if it's not that it's time to run, it continuously yields. So it consumes CPU time. So right now it's loop-based waiting up to the given tick. The thread that called this function, timer sleep, is inserted into the ready list after the given tick. So in this function, timer sleep, the thread yield, you can see that there's a start time, and when timer elapsed start is elapsed, and we check the time, and the set number of ticks hasn't passed yet, it continues to yield. So thread yield yields the CPU and inserts the thread to the ready list, and the timer ticks, that function, it returns the value of the current tick, and timer elapsed returns how many ticks have passed since start. So that's pretty straightforward. The thread yield function, it yields the CPU and inserts the thread to the ready list. So that's what this function does. So there are functions in thread yield. So I have a copy of the thread yield function right here. So the thread yield function, it first checks for the current thread. The thread current function returns the current thread, and then it sets the interrupt, disables the interrupt. So while the interrupt is disabled, the timer interrupt cannot interrupt the running process. So there will be no synchronization or multiprocessing, multi-threading when interrupt is disabled. And if the current thread is not the idle thread, it will push the current thread to the back of the ready list. So that's using the list pushback method. And then the schedule method does the context switching. So yeah, so that's the thread yield function. Do you have any questions until here? Okay. So the goal of this project is for the timer sleep to use sleep and wake up. So instead of just busy waiting, we want the thread that called timer sleep to go into sleep state. So go into the blocked state and wake up when its time is up. Instead of consuming CPU time this way, it will not be consuming CPU time while it's waiting. So in order to do that, you want to maintain a separate list, sleep list. So before we only had a ready list, a list of threads ready to run, but then we want to maintain a separate list called sleep list to maintain a list of threads that's sleeping and we don't want to schedule right away. So when the running thread calls timer sleep, it will we want to insert the thread to the timer sleep list. And then when it's time to wake up, then we'll get the thread out of the sleep list and push it back to the ready list to schedule CPU time for the waked up thread. So so I'll go into more details about the actual implementation. So you would have to define the sleep queue. So you would have to define a sleep list and initialize it. So here you have to think about where to declare this list and when to initialize this list. So, and there's another thing to think about for the alarm clock. You have to think about the global tick and the local tick. So the kernel timer interrupt handler needs to check which threads to wake up. So in the sleep list, we have a list of threads that is sleeping, that called timer sleep. Each thread needs to maintain a local tick to maintain the time to wake up. So we want to modify the thread structure, the thread data structure, to store the time to wake up. And we also want to maintain a tick, global variable tick, which should be the minimum value of all local ticks of threads. And so when that global time is met, we want to scan through the sleep list and wake up any threads that should be waken up. So here in this slide, we're saying that you should define a local tick for each thread and a global tick. So you have to think about where to put these ticks and where to initialize them. So local tick, of course, should go into the thread structure. You could name it wake up tick, and it should use int64 type. So we're giving you a direct hint of how it should be implemented. So when timer sleep is called, we have to check the tick. If there's time left till the wake up, we want to remove the caller thread from ready list and insert it to sleep queue. So before previously, the original code just yielded continuously with the while loop. But then now, if the timer elapsed, then if the time didn't elapse yet, we want to call thread sleep, and in that thread sleep, you want to do the things necessary to maintain the sleep list and maintain the sleep list and wake them up in the right time. So you'll learn later that with the synchronization, the value of start might not be valid at time 2, but for alarm clock, you don't have to consider that for now, so you can forget it for now. But you might have to think about how to fix it for later synchronization tasks. So the thread sleep function that you should implement, it should change the state of the caller thread to blocked and put it to sleep queue. So you would want to implement a new function, thread sleep, and then it should do this. If the current thread is not idle thread, change the state of the caller thread to blocked, store the local tick to wake up, and update the global tick if necessary, and call schedule to schedule another thread. And when you manipulate the thread list, you should always disable the interrupt, because thread list is important data structure that is shared amongst many threads. So if it gets messed up because of any synchronization issues, it will really mess up the code. So, and also you have to think about the timer interrupt. So timer interrupt is the heart of everything. It determines which threads to wake up every time and when the timer interrupt occurs. So for the threads to wake up, you should remove them from the sleep queue and insert it to the ready list. And you should do it in the timer interrupt. And I don't know if you learned it in class, but timer interrupt is a function that's called every certain amount of time to maintain the data structures in OS. So here, one thing that you should really put in mind is that you should not forget to change the state of the thread from sleep to ready. if the timer tick has elapsed. So timer interrupt function looks something like this. So we would increment the global tick, and we'll also update the CPU usage for running process with the thread tick. And then the code to add here is to check sleep list and global tick, find any threads to wake up, move them to the ready list if necessary, and update the global tick. So in summary, the functions to modify here are thread init. So in thread init, you should add the code to initialize the sleep queue data structure. And in timer sleep, you should call the function that insert the thread to the sleep queue. And in timer interrupt, at every timer interrupt, you should check whether some thread must wake up from the sleep queue and call the wake up function. Here are some design tips for modularization. So you basically have 4 large functions to add. The first function is a function that sets the thread state to blocked and wait after inserting into the sleep queue. The second function is a function that finds the thread to wake up from the sleep queue and make awake the thread. And the third function is the function that saves the minimum tick value of tick that threads have to update the global tick. And the fourth function is a function that returns the minimum value of the local ticks. So after implementing these functionalities, if you run alarm multiple test case, originally it should be busy waiting. So the thread would have 0 idle ticks and 860 kernel ticks and 0 user ticks, although the test case calls for timer sleep. Because it busy waits, it consumes CPU time. But then after implementing all the functions that I mentioned, it would not be busy waiting and it will be using the sleep queue. So now the thread will have 550 idle ticks and some kernel ticks because it's running and 0 user ticks. So that's it for alarm clocks. Any questions until here? Okay, so I'll move on to the next part, which is priority scheduling. So the main goal here is that Pinterest right now uses FIFO scheduling, meaning first in, first out. And we want to modify the Pinterest scheduler to do priority scheduling. So we want the threads with higher priority to run first, run faster than the threads with lower priority. So we want to sort the ready list by thread priority and sort the wait list for synchronization primitives like SEM4 and conditional variables, and implement preemption, which means that when a higher priority thread is created, it would preempt lower priority thread to run schedule itself. And the preemption point is when the thread is put into ready list, not every time when a timer interrupt is called. So the files to modify for priority scheduling are all in the threads directory. So there are threads.c, threads.h, and threads sync.c and sync.h. So sync here is for synchronization. So now we have ready list. So originally we only had the ready list, but after implementing alarm clock, we'll have a sleep list. And with a function, if a thread calls timer sleep, it will go into sleep list and wait for it to wake up. And then when it wakes up, we'll schedule it back to the ready list. And with the synchronization, we'd have to maintain another list called wait list. Wait list is a list of threads that is waiting for some synchronization primitives like locks or conditional variables. So here, with priority scheduling, we would want to sort the ready list so that we run the thread with highest priority. And for the wait list, we will want to get that thread with highest priority first and put it back to the ready list once the lock is released. So there are 3 things to consider. So when selecting a thread to run in the ready list, you should always select the one with the highest priority. And for preemption, when inserting a new thread to the ready list, you should compare the priority with the running thread. and preempt the running thread if the new thread has higher priority. And for synchronization, so there are lock, which is implemented with semaphore and conditional, and there are also conditional variables. So when selecting a thread from the set of threads waiting for a lock or conditional variable, select the one with the highest priority. So here is a slide about priority in Pintos. So priority ranges from pre-min. It's a predefined macro. Macro. So it's 0 to pri-max, which is 63. The larger the number, the higher the priority, and the default is 31. So Pintos sets the initial priority when thread is created by thread create, and the existing functions are thread set priority, which changes the priority of current thread to new priority, and thread get priority, which returns the priority of the current thread. So here you would have to modify thread create. So here you would have to make the following modifications. You would have to insert thread in ready list in the order of priority, not FIFO. One thing to note here is that sorting threads like this is not scalable. It works because Pintos is relatively small, like it's designed for an assignment, but you would not really do this for any production OS. And when the thread is added to, the second point to update is when the thread is added to the ready list, you should compare the priority of the new thread and the priority of the current thread and implement and do preemption if necessary. And if the priority, for the preemption, you should call schedule, which means that the current thread yields CPU to another thread. So here are more details about the thread create function. So when inserting a thread to the ready list, you should always compare the priority with the currently running thread, and preempt if necessary. And you should insert the code that does the following in this portion of thread create. And there are other functions to modify. So there's thread unblock. So when thread is unblocked, it's inserted to ready list in priority order. And for thread yield, when the current thread yields CPU and it is inserted to ready list, and is inserted back to ready list, you should always insert it in priority order. And for thread set priority, when we set the priority of the current thread, you should also reorder the ready list in order of priority. So for thread unblock, we'll just give you a very big hint. So for thread unblock, when unblocking a thread, right now it uses list pushback, meaning it will just push to the back of the list. But what you want to do instead is to use list insert ordered and use priority as the value to compare. So that's it for the ready list. So now here we're talking about synchronization primitives and the wait list. So for synchronization primitives in Pintos, you have to think about three things: locks, semaphores, and condition variables. And you should wake up the waiting thread with respect to the thread's priority. What it means is this. So right now, Pintos is FIFO, it's first in, first out. So when we have a low priority thread running and it acquires a lock, and another threads with higher priorities requests locks at 3 different time periods. If it's FIFO, then the thread that requested the lock first will be woken up first. It will get the lock first, regardless of priority. So although this purple thread here has the highest priority, it would get the lock actually after this blue thread, which has lower priority. So we do not want that. So we want to make this priority based. So when threads try to acquire a semaphore, we want to sort the waiters list in order of priority. So in order to do that, you should modify the functions semma down and cond wait. So the ideal behavior would be this. If a thread with low priority is running with the lock, and threads with higher priorities request for the same lock at 3 different time periods, although the highest priority thread requested for the lock at a later time period, it would, when the lock is released, it would acquire the lock first, and then it will release the lock, and the thread with second priority will get the lock, and then when the lock is again released, the thread, the dark blue thread, although it requested for the lock first, will get hold of the lock last, because scheduling is based on priority. So semaphores and Pintos right now, it has the struct semaphore has 2 values, unsigned value and struct list waiters. So value is the current value of semaphore, and the waiters is a list of waiting threads. So there are 3 functions that deal with semaphores. There's semma init, which initialize semaphore to a given value, semma down, which requests the semaphore, and if semaphore is acquired, it decreases the value by 1, and semma up is, what it does is it releases the semaphore and increases the value by 1. So locks in Pintos. So the struct lock has 2 structs inside it. The one is a thread pointer. It's a pointer to the thread holding the lock, and then it contains semaphore for controlling access. So there are 3 functions that control, manage lock. There's lock init, which initializes the lock data structure, and there's lock acquire, which requests the lock, and there's lock release, which releases the lock. So, and this is the structure of condition variables in Pintos. It just has a list of waiters, a list of waiting threads. So, and there are actually 4 functions in this case to manage condition variables. So there's cond init, which initializes the condition variable data structure. There's cond wait, which makes the thread wait for the signal by the condition variable. And there's cond signal, which sends a signal to the thread of the highest priority waiting in the condition variable. And there's cond broadcast, which sends a signal to all threads waiting in the condition variable. So in order to implement the priority scheduling synchronization, you have to modify the following functions. You have to modify the semma down and conda wait functions to insert the thread at waiters list in order of priority. And you should sort the waiters and list in order of priority when these functions are called. So when these functions are called, you have to consider the case of changing priority of threads in the waiters list. So for semma up and con, you would have to modify semma up and con signal as well. And there are some special cases that you should think about. One is priority inversion. So it's the situation where a thread of higher priority waits for a thread of lower priority. So again, we have a low priority thread running, and a high priority thread requests a lock that's held by the low priority thread. And then we have a purple thread with middle priority. Because it has higher priority than the yellow one, it preempts the yellow one and then gets the CPU time. But because the highest priority thread is waiting for the lock held by the lowest priority thread, although the highest priority thread should be scheduled first, the middle thread is actually getting CPU time. And we call this priority inversion, and then we want to avoid this. So in order to avoid this, you should implement what's called priority donation. So when the highest priority thread runs and asks for a lock held by the lower priority thread, it should also donate its priority to the lock holder. So when the thread H requests for lock held by thread L, it would also donate its priority and preempt the middle thread M and actually schedule the CPU time to the thread L and also get the lock and schedule itself, and then the thread M should run. So this is priority donation. So there are actually some complications with priority donation. So when there are multiple threads waiting for a lock held by a low priority thread, the priority donated to the thread holding the lock should be the highest priority among its waiters. And also, if there is a chain of locks, you should also donate it to its future waiters. So if we have a thread T3 with priority 7, T3 waiting for a lock held by T2, waiting for a lock held by T1, and if we have a T4 which with priority 14, which wants to acquire lock C, we would not only donate its priority to T3, but we would also donate its priority to T2 and T1. This is called nested donation. Because if we don't do that, the low priority threads will actually make this high priority thread run very late. So we want to do nested donation. And there's the case of multiple donation. So if we have multiple locks, one thread holding multiple locks and different threads waiting for each of the locks, it should of course get the priority of the highest thread. But then when when this lock C is released and this T4 is scheduled and done, this T1 should return to its original priority and then actually get donation from another one of its waiters. So after T4 is done executing, T1's priority should no longer be 13. It should be modified to the highest priority among its waiter threads. Yep, so that's multiple donation. So for multiple donation, the data structure you should implement is donations, a list of donors. So for the thread struct, you want to add a list called donations to maintain a list of donors. So if you inherited priority from another thread, you want to make sure that that thread is still running if you have that priority. So you want to maintain that list. So thread L would have thread M and H as in its donations list, because thread H is holding a lock, is waiting for a lock held by thread L, and thread M is waiting for a lock held by thread L. So thread L has donations from thread M and thread H. And the data structure for nested donation, you would want to add a structure called wait on lock, actually a lock pointer, so that you store the lock that the current thread is waiting for. So if thread H is waiting on a lock held by, waiting on lock B, which is held by thread M, which is waiting on a lock that's held by thread L, you would want to kind of track it down this way. So for the actual implementation of priority donation, you would have to modify the following functions. You would have to modify the init thread function so that it initializes data structure for priority donation. And you would have to modify lock acquire. So if the lock is not available, you should store the address of the lock in the thread structure. And you should store the current priority and maintain donated threads on the list. And also donate priority if necessary. And for lock released, when the lock is released, we want to remove the thread that holds the lock on the donation list and set the priority properly. And for function thread set priority, when a thread's priority changes, you would have to update the donations list and the donated priorities accordingly. So after implementing priority scheduling, if you run make check in the threads directory, you should see that all of these test cases have passed. So if you have, after implementing alarm clock, you should have this alarm test cases passing, and after implementing priority scheduling, you should have the priority test cases passing. So that's all I have prepared for priority scheduling. Do you have any questions? So meanwhile, some of you are thinking of some questions. We have one student who submitted the Project Zero Google form early before we modified it to add team members. So, and there are 4 students who did not submit Project Zero, so we don't know who you're working with or whether you're working solo. And we'll call the names of those students after the lab session. So if your name is called, please come here to the TAs so that we can get those things sorted out. So final call for questions. Okay. We'll also upload a campus wire announcement after the lab session. So if there are no questions, I think we can end the lab session here. Thank you.